In this video, we're going to transform an old 1990s delivery truck into an incredible mobile pizza restaurant like nothing you've ever seen before. The first thing we need to do is remove the cargo box. Since the box is huge, 26 feet long, I'm using this plasma cutter to start cutting at the rear section of the truck. This isn't his first time working on modifying a large truck, so he began by removing the box with a forklift. The removal process was actually quite simple. He placed a few guides at the front to make sure the box wouldn't slip off the frame, then used a chain with the fork to pull it backwards. These boxes are very commonly repurposed as storage units, so after taking it off the truck, he decided to list it on Facebook. The box sold within 2 days for $1,300. Before installing the shipping container, he needed to work on painting the frame and cab. He started by cleaning the truck using a special scraper designed to remove dust and grease. Again, he used the plasma cutter to continue cutting at the rear of the truck. After that, he switched to a rotary sander with 220 grit sandpaper to expose the surface flaws. On the right-hand side of the truck, it became clear that the vehicle had been in an accident before, leaving some porous defects and damage in the frame itself. Once he welded that section, he began marking all the visible flaws. To keep track, he used different colors to indicate which spots needed primer filler and which ones required finishing putty. For the primer filler, he used this particular type that was not only of good quality, but also inexpensive. Then he moved on to the finishing putty, choosing Delfin Glaze, which worked perfectly for sealing small hulls. It dried quickly, sanded easily, and gave excellent results. Before applying the final coat of paint, he had to sand the entire truck once more. This time, he used 400 grit sandpaper to smooth out the whole surface.
After that, he started applying paint to the frame using Road Black, which is one of his favorite coatings. This paint covers everything from bare steel to slightly rusted metal, and thanks to its high quality, it adhered perfectly. Once the entire frame was coated in satin black, he sprayed a layer of the same color over the primer filler on the doors. He then painted the door handles in the same shade as well. The final coat he planned to apply would be glossy black, and for this he used a paint gun with a 1.25mm nozzle. At this stage, he faced a major challenge. Painting in black is considered one of the hardest colors to work with because it highlights every flaw on the surface. He had to pay close attention to ensure nothing was missed. After laying down the first coat, he used a strong light to check for any spots he might have overlooked or imperfections that stood out. He then applied the second coat and again used the same light to compare the difference between the first and second layers. The contrast was especially noticeable on the right side of the truck. Next came the most exciting part of the project, mounting the container onto the truck. The only problem was that he was working alone, so he had to move back and forth between the forklift and the truck to lift and position the container properly. The process took some time, as you could tell from the movement of the clouds in the sky. The following step was crucial. He began cutting both the top and bottom sections of the container so he could add as much glass as possible to the walls. He divided the large metal sheet into 3 separate pieces to make it easier to handle. Using a chain and a manual tool, he carefully lowered each piece one by one. After removing the sections, he had to clean the surface thoroughly to prepare the inner frame properly. The solution here was smoothing, which required a lot of work. This truck was longer than standard ones usually converted into restaurants, so he needed to build a lower extension that would later serve as the serving area for distributing the pizzas.
He began building this section using a 6-inch steel channel to align with the lower part of the shipping container. After assembling the entire frame, he moved on to the interior section. He marked out the exact location for the lower section, then used this tool to remove the bolts that had been fastening the wooden flooring. The floorboards were over an inch thick, but since there was metal underneath, he had to be extremely careful while working with the saw. He set it to about 7 or 8 inches and started cutting. He repeated this process 3 times until he was finally able to remove all the wood. The next step was preparing the inner frame that would hold the glass. For this, he used 1.5-inch square steel tubing.
While working, he noticed the metal had shifted slightly after cutting the subframe. To fix this, he brought in a chain and tightened it to pull the steel back into place. The plan was to over-tighten the steel so that once the entire frame was welded and the chain was released, the metal would spring back into the exact position needed. This would make it easier to install both the glass and the door later on. At the same time, he prepared a small opening above the serving window or entry door, so the final design would include 4 large windows plus a smaller one. Once the main frame was completed, he switched to another saw and began cutting more of the square tubing to finish building the lowered serving section. The final step here was attaching the steel panels. He installed them one by one to enclose the container and get it finished to the highest standard. After completing the framework, it was time to build the staircase. Instead of cutting small pieces and welding them together, he decided to use a single steel sheet and work it with a grinder. By carving into the sheet without cutting it all the way through, he was able to bend it at a 90-degree angle. He then welded support brackets onto it before reinstalling it on the truck as one solid piece. Once the staircase was welded into position, he released the chain that had been holding the steel in tension and confirmed that everything was perfectly aligned.
The truck was now perfectly balanced, but the work was far from finished. The container still needed welding in every section, and unfortunately, he had run out of welding rods. This forced him to call for help and bring in someone else to work alongside him on the welding. Together, they tackled it step by step until that entire section was finally completed. The next stage was the door, which turned out to be one of the most difficult parts of the entire project. This wasn't just any door, it was the only moving part of the design, so it had to withstand years of heavy commercial use without failing. On top of that, there was the service window, which needed to swing upward, and the service counter, which had to fold downward. Because of all these requirements, the door alone took almost as much time to complete as the rest of the build combined. After assembling the main door frame, he decided to cover the lower portion with a piece of shipping container paneling he had salvaged from another truck he'd modified before. The result looked far better than if he had used plain sheet metal. But that's when a problem appeared, something you may have noticed as well. The door was missing one crucial component, a handle. He had completely forgotten to prepare the housing for the lock and handle assembly. Of course, he corrected this oversight by fabricating and installing them afterward. As for the service window, it needed to be slim enough to fit inside the door frame, light enough to be lifted by ordinary gas struts, yet strong enough to endure the constant use it would face. To achieve this, he used half-inch tubing and reinforced it with cross braces to add stiffness. He also bent another piece of the same tubing to create a precise curve. This design had 2 advantages. It made the window slightly stronger and provided a proper mounting point for the struts. For the exterior face, he used sheet steel, carefully marking out the frame positions. He then went back to the machine to add a slight curve along the sides and bottom edge. This ensured that the window would close flush and seal tightly against the door.
After that, he moved on to seam sealing, but this time he tried something new. Instead of welding, he used this adhesive to secure the frame to the sheet metal. One of his followers had recommended it before as an alternative to welding, since welding can distort and warp the metal surface. While the adhesive was drying, he shifted his focus to designing custom fenders for the container. He cut a gentle curve into the sheet metal, then attached a flat steel strip over it, giving the fenders a very distinctive look. With that section done, he turned to the rear of the truck. There were still about 3 feet of metal pads left on the chassis, so he used a grinder to make a clean cut about 2 inches away from the container. He then welded a flat plate onto the end and added this column-like piece underneath to give the rear a properly finished look. At this point, the next step should have been painting, since the exterior work was completed. But before that, he decided to build the roof frame. He used 2x4 lumber to create the framework because ceiling tiles would be installed later and they couldn't just be mounted directly onto the sheet metal, especially with lighting fixtures planned for that area. To solve this, he applied construction adhesive along the interior, then climbed onto the container, drilled holes through the sheet metal, and added a waterproof protective layer. After that, he secured the wood in place with screws from above. This way, the whole structure was firmly fastened with both adhesive and screws, ready to support the ceiling tiles. Now it was time to move on to the stage he was most excited about: painting. He was especially thankful that he had built his paint booth or spray bay because it gave him plenty of space to work. Honestly, he hadn't planned for it to be this large, but it turned out to be a stroke of luck, especially since it was raining outside. Painting in the open air without the booth would have been impossible. The paint gun he used had a 6-inch nozzle, allowing for smooth and even coverage. The results were stunning. The paint came out clean, uniform, and beautifully finished. After that, he began installing the ceiling tiles, each measuring 24 by 24 inches. The grid framework was about 26-gauge steel, making it lightweight and easy to secure with a staple gun and screws.
At this point, he realized he had made a mistake with the lighting layout. The fixtures were originally set in the second and fourth rows, but they should have been placed in the first and third. He corrected the issue by cutting out the openings for the spotlights and pulling the wiring through, then continued installing the rest of the ceiling tiles. For the lowered serving section, he decided to apply a liner coating. He had tried several types before, but this one proved to be the best, as it created a uniform layer without leaving any streaks. The key was maintaining a spraying distance of about 30 inches to ensure the finish came out smooth and even. Next, it was time to install the glass, which required some help. His wife assisted him with this part. They began with the smallest window above the service door to make the process easier. He applied a special glass adhesive, then secured an interior frame to press everything tightly in place, ensuring it was fully waterproof. Each pane weighed about 95 pounds, so he used clamps to lift them onto the mobile scaffolding. This glass was especially strong and unique because it included a safety layer that prevented it from shattering into pieces if broken. That's why he uses this type in all his projects. To apply the adhesive, he worked with an electric silicone gun since the material was too thick for a regular gun. Even the clamps and grips he used here were different from the standard ones, but with them, the glass installation was completed successfully. With the glazing finished, he moved on to the ceiling tiles. His friends helped him with this part, and the tiles, being waterproof, clicked together as easily as puzzle pieces. After that, he built a frame between the two levels and installed a counter with a shelf for storage, which would also serve as the base for the menu board. Using a precision measuring tool saved him a great deal of time, and everything fit perfectly on the first attempt. He then decided to fabricate his own pipe covers instead of buying them, cutting and welding them neatly. The next phase was to continue the welding work and construct the countertop and shelf using 18-gauge steel. However, the material was too heavy for his cutting machine, so he had to switch to using the gear-driven saw.
For the cutting, he used a gear-driven saw, and for painting, he chose a special type of coating that adheres directly to clean steel. He also installed 20mm aluminum bars to serve as the backing for the shelf. Since the truck wasn't well insulated and would be running an oven at 700 degrees, proper ventilation was essential. To solve this, he installed a fan capable of clearing the air in just 20 seconds. While waiting for the rear appliances to arrive, he worked on a foldable counter by the service window, designed to drop down whenever the window opened, making it easy to serve pizza slices. At the same time, he turned his attention to the front of the truck. Although the truck was running, it had several issues: an oil leak, an exhaust leak, cracked bolts, and even a radiator leak. On top of that, one of the fuel injectors was clogged. He addressed each of these problems one by one. He fixed the exhaust manifold, which had 4 broken bolts, carefully extracting them without breaking anything else. He replaced the faulty injector, changed the gaskets on both the valve cover and the intake manifold, and upgraded them with high-quality replacements.
He also swapped out the exhaust bolts for copper ones with larger nuts, allowing them to withstand the constant expansion and contraction without snapping. With that, the mechanical work was wrapped up. However, there was still a major problem: the fiberglass front chassis. He tried to find an affordable replacement but failed, so he decided to repair it himself in just 4 days to save money. He secured the side fender with a metal strap, built a small wooden jig to hold the lower section in place, and used urethane adhesive to repair the headlight area and fill its gaps. For the cracks in the grille, he applied panel bonding adhesive. By the end of the first day, his goal was to complete the first fiberglass layer so it could cure and harden overnight. On the second day, the lower section was solid, so he moved on to cleaning and prepping the upper section, though he fell slightly behind schedule.
He had to keep working late into the night, since the fiberglass job needed to be fully completed. The curing process took longer than expected, but in the end, he managed to finish the first filler layer on the front chassis. By the third day, he began sanding everything down in preparation for paint. His plan was straightforward. Apply an initial coat of primer to reveal imperfections, fill those flaws, then spray a second coat of primer. Finally, by the end of the day, he would lay down the black paint. The real challenge was to complete all of this in just 1 day. But then something unexpected happened. Rain. He had to stop immediately, cover the truck to protect the work, and wait for the weather to clear. Once the rain eased up, he moved the truck and pressed on, applying 2 coats of primer. Since he wasn't a professional bodywork specialist, these primer layers gave him room to correct imperfections before the final coat. On the 4th day, he finally sprayed the black paint, and the result looked fantastic. The sleek black finish gave the truck an elegant, professional appearance. For the front logo, however, there was an issue. The Chevrolet emblem was missing the letter G, and Chevrolet no longer supplied that specific badge. His solution was creative. He found a used GMC emblem of the same size, cut out the letter, and glued it firmly into place. The wheels and the front fender were the last pieces left unpainted, so he placed them in the spray booth, gave them a quick coat, and added a metallic gloss to match the polished tile look on top. Around this time, the first major piece of restaurant equipment arrived, a pizza prep table with a refrigerated section for ingredients. The only problem was, it was designed for a traditional kitchen, not a food truck. To adapt it, he removed the casters and mounted it onto sturdy supports. He assembled the components with simple, practical solutions to avoid future issues, sticking to the principle that the simpler the design, the more reliable it would be. By the end of the day, there was solid progress. Everything was coming together smoothly, and the prep table was now secured to both the floor and the wall. At this stage, the truck was running on shore power.
Once the generator was running, the truck would be fully independent, so he needed to design a custom mount for it. He built a base from angle iron, removed the wheels, and bolted the generator directly to the frame. Then came the arrival of the premium pizza oven, weighing in at 2,800 pounds. The best part was that it was in excellent condition overall, but the front panel had a bend in it. He had no idea how it happened, so he called the company. They offered to ship him a replacement, but it would take time. Instead, he decided to try fixing it himself. Beneath the oven, he built a wood storage rack using expanded metal for protection, especially to safeguard the glass. The oven itself was framed with 2.5-inch steel tubing, which he drilled and welded firmly at the 4 corners. To reinforce the frame even further, he added an extra steel brace. The exhaust outlet was originally at a 45-degree angle when it should have been vertical, so he cut it at 22.5 degrees, flipped it, and welded it back. Perfect. To lift the oven, he relied on an old 68-year-old hoist, moving it step by step until it was finally secured inside the truck. Given the oven's massive weight, he made sure it was supported not just by the wooden decking, but also by steel braces underneath. The chimney was installed with high-temperature sealant to prevent leaks, but unfortunately, the replacement front panel still didn't fit. In the meantime, he repaired and reinstalled the old one, which worked well enough until the company eventually sent him a brand new part. Since the truck would be constantly on the move, he also upgraded the design. He mounted the aluminum panels onto a dedicated frame instead of fiberglass, swapped out the insulation, and installed a new chimney. To ensure every seam was airtight, he sealed the openings with heat-resistant metal tape. Finally, he added a water channel to prevent staining on the glass. With all that work done, it was time to see the final result of this massive conversion. Stepping inside, the service window is the first thing you notice, complete with a small shelf, perfect for quickly grabbing your pizza and heading out. Next to it is an outlet with 2 ports, one USB-C and one USB-A, along with the main light switch. Above the steps, there's a stainless steel counter with a prep table and storage space underneath, plus an additional lockable surface with a unique latch. In the corner, he installed a deep stainless steel sink, and right next to it will eventually be the soda cooler, still on backorder. The centerpiece, of course, is the beautiful wood-fired oven, the cleanest spot in the entire truck. Right beside it, there's a ventilation fan and an extra power outlet in case they ever decide to add a dedicated oven fan later. That section will also house the refrigerator once it arrives. And that's it. The food truck transformation is finally complete. Subscribe to the channel and see you next time.